A National Security Council aide testified to impeachment investigators this week that a few days after he reported concerns about what President Trump said in a July phone call with the Ukrainian president, a top White House lawyer directed him not to discuss the contents of the call, according to people familiar with his deposition. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander S. Vindman, the top Ukraine expert at the council, told investigators that when he brought his concerns to the lawyer, John A. Eisenberg, Mr. Eisenberg and another lawyer at the council quickly made the decision to move the transcript of the phone call into the White House's most classified computer system, one of the people said, insisting on anonymity to discuss the colonel's closed-door testimony. The disclosures added to the picture of a hasty effort at the White House to lock down the record of what transpired in the now famous July 25 call, amid alarm among officials there about the conversation in which Mr. Trump asked President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine to launch an investigation into former Vice President Joseph R. Biden Jr., a leading political rival, and Mr. Biden's family. The new details of Colonel Vindman's testimony were first reported by Politico. Timothy Morrison, another National Security Council official, also testified on Thursday that he consulted Mr. Eisenberg in the aftermath of the call, concerned that, while he did not believe it contained anything illegal, its disclosure could lead to damaging consequences. Colonel Vindman testified this week that he twice reported concerns about Mr. Trump and his inner circle to superiors over their handling of Ukraine. A decorated Iraq War veteran, he said he acted out of a sense of duty after hearing the conversation. The colonel was among the aides listening in to the call from the White House Situation Room, and reported it later that day to Mr. Eisenberg. Colonel Vindman was accompanied by his identical twin brother, Yevgeny, who is a lawyer at the council. Toward the end of the meeting, Mr. Eisenberg's deputy, Michael Ellis, entered the room. After Colonel Vindman made his complaint, but while he and his brother were still in the room, Mr. Eisenberg and Mr. Ellis discussed how to handle the transcript, and Mr. Eisenberg decided to place it into the White House's most secure system to avoid leaks, according to one of the people familiar with his account. Several days later, after a CIA officer complained about the call to the CIA's General Counsel, Mr. Eisenberg directed Colonel Vindman not to discuss the call further. The testimony only adds to House investigators' interest in Mr. Eisenberg, whom Democrats subpoenaed late Friday to appear for a deposition on Monday, according to people familiar with the matter. The White House is likely to order him not to cooperate, making his appearance uncertain. Colonel Vindman is not the only impeachment witness to point to Mr. Eisenberg's role in testimony, and a whistleblower complaint later filed by the CIA officer appears to describe his actions. Fiona Hill, the council's former senior director for Russia and Europe, testified last month that she had gone to Mr. Eisenberg to report concerns at the direction of her boss, John R. Bolton, who was Mr. Trump's national security advisor at the time. Ms. Hill and Mr. Bolton were alarmed by a June White House meeting in which the American ambassador to the European Union pressured Ukrainian officials to conduct investigations Mr. Trump wanted. The subpoena came as investigators said they had scheduled additional new voluntary depositions for next week. They called Energy Secretary Rick Perry, who was deeply involved in American outreach to Ukraine, to answer questions on Wednesday, but a spokeswoman for the Energy Department said Mr. Perry had no intention of taking part in a secret Star Chamber inquisition. Investigators also set appearances for Russell Vought, the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget, David Hale, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs, and T. Ulrich Breck-Buell, counselor to the Secretary of State. It was unclear if any of them would comply. Investigators also subpoenaed Brian McCormack, Mr. Perry's chief of staff, to testify on Monday. Colonel Vindman is not the whistleblower who sparked the impeachment inquiry, but was among the officials who had grown deeply concerned about the role of the president's personal lawyer, Rudolph W. Giuliani, who was pressuring Ukrainian officials to investigate both the Bidens and an unsubstantiated theory that Ukraine, rather than Russia, interfered in the 2016 elections. Amid Mr. Giuliani's efforts, the White House Budget Office suspended a package of $391 million in military aid to Ukraine, a directive that previous impeachment witnesses have testified came from Mr. Trump himself. Mr. Trump and the White House have sent conflicting messages on why they withheld the aid. At one point, Mr. Trump's acting chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, told reporters that the decision was connected to pressing Ukraine to undertake investigation that Mr. Trump wanted, telling reporters questioning the apparent quid pro quo to get over it. But he later backtracked and said there was no connection. Testimony by a growing roster of Trump administration national security officials and diplomats has revealed widespread unease about what amounted to a shadow foreign policy on Ukraine aimed at advancing Mr. Trump's political interests. Ukrainian officials sought guidance about Mr. Giuliani's role from Colonel Vindman, whose job, as Director for Eastern European and Russian Affairs, is to act as a key national security point of contact for the country and its officials. The National Security Council's position, which was communicated by the colonel, was to focus on official diplomatic channels and not become enmeshed in American politics. As queries accumulated from Ukrainian officials about the situation, the colonel delivered that message personally to Mr. Zelensky during a visit in May to mark his inauguration, in a meeting also attended by Mr. Perry.